Hello. This is week 2 of Patrick Lecture 242, The Spiritual Meaning of Political Systems. And by this week, I've received a reality check from participants who have not participated. Attendance has been down. And my interpretation of that, which is part of what I'm going to talk about, my interpretation of that is that they're weary of the topic. They're put off by the topic, and that's been the feedback of those who have participated. There's something about bringing up a topic that hits a sore spot that discourages people from feeling enthusiastic or hopeful. And that is the very reason I picked the topic. It is true that global news in October of 2004 is a little discouraging. And that's where it may be important for us to step up. Someone pointed out this week that this lecture is about leadership, and that's one of the reasons I chose it is yes, it's about leadership. It's about internal leadership that picks up on manifested group leadership. In other words, we're part of the group, we contribute to it on a somewhat invisible level, and what that group creates mirrors back to us, and we react from that. It's a churning process. It goes on and on and on, and it refines, it changes over time. One of the things I noticed was this. The 2025 Patrick Leadership Conference in May in Portugal, the topics that they have chosen represented to me originally as a little pie in the sky. They originally struck me as a little ethereal, a little abstract. And that can be true with spiritual groups. However, after having participated in one of their webinars, I felt a connection. And that struck me as quite curious. I'm not normally feeling connected to group activities. And my connection was about my self-leadership, about where I hold back my hopes, my desires, my dreams, because they seem simplistic, Pollyannish, not feasible, not in tune with reality. And so I tend to hold them back. And it struck me that in the choosing of the topics for the conference, that there was an encouragement to step into the fundamental reasons we're leading in the first place, to step into the knowledge we do have, instead of saying there's more. Of course, there's more. There's always more. What do we have that we can share? What hopeful message, what encouragement, what connection to the divine can we foster that is possible today that will help people deal with the reality in the world? And it led me to think about leadership. Once again, I like to think in terms of very concrete examples. Leader says, jump over this ditch. Ditch is 2 feet. Sure, I can do that. Leader says, jump over this ditch. It's 3 feet. Okay, if I get a little running start, I can do that. Leader says, jump over this ditch. It's 4 feet or 1.5 meters, 1.25 meters. And I pause because I may not feel that I can do that. So I want to see the leader do it first. Here, you do it, and then I might give it a try. Based upon, if you're very, very young and athletic, and I'm not, then you may be able to leap that chasm, and I may not be able to. However, even if I can't, I can be inspired by you. I can be inspired by leadership that is willing to see a task, set a task, describe a task, and themselves engage in a task. Despite my personal concerns, fears, limitations, overreactions to being asked to do something that I might fail at. So I'm speaking of this as a follower watching leadership. As a leader on any level, I need to encourage people to follow. So I need to leap that ditch. Or sometimes I need to say, you can do it. I can't. But it's possible and you can, and I will support you. And I will give you what you need to attempt to make that leap. Now, the leap I'm talking about is a leap of faith. To believe that something is possible when the odds are against it, when the polls are against it, when common sense is against it. Now, all of you have heard sooner or later in your history, anecdotally, about so-called miracles where people succeeded even though they shouldn't have, even though the odds were against them. To some extent, I'd like to address their willingness to try created that so-called miracle. Their willingness to attempt proved whether it was possible or not. And to some extent, that's what leadership is. However, you can't get too far ahead of your followers. You can't go way off in the distance and describe a world that they can't imagine because you're not communicating to them. So there's a tension between leading and following where you need to continue to allow that something is possible by the understanding and standards of the people you're trying to lead. It's not easy. Patrick Lecture 237 on leadership describes this. I always describe that lecture as the art of frustration. And my teachers kept correcting me saying, Jan, it's the art of transcending frustration. But for me, I was involved in leadership early in my pathwork days. It was the art of frustration. It was all frustration and I was trying to deal with it. Rather than seeing that I needed to transcend that frustration, I was dealing with it like ping pong balls that you have to keep hitting back all the time. And it was very frustrating, just being on the board or being part of administration. So that's the leadership element of this lecture. Despite how you may read the lecture, I encourage you to see that the guide permits you to read it externally or internally, external systems. You can go off on that. Or you can see the guide's reference to internal, where the internal is reflected externally. So let's go back to attendances down. This is where leadership gets really tricky. Did I tap into something important that needed to be tapped into? And people are running away or shying away, but it was still tapped. That's the question. If a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, did it fall? If you tap into something and people turn away and say no, was it still tapped? I believe it was. And sometimes it is important to be unpopular. Sometimes it's important to bring up a topic that on the rational ego level is rejected. Because it can't be completely rejected. We are bigger than our egos, than our conscious minds. And to be reminded of divine truth stays with us. It does, it stays with us. We're not fools, we're not ignorant, we're not computer programs. We're living divine beings. And we know what we're here for. Some part of us knows what we're here for. And when that part is tapped, it's like poets talk about it in terms of some internal bell ringing where you can feel it throughout your being, even though you can't say what happened. Something rang within you. And the best leadership is able to ring that bell. I'm not saying that bell can't be rung by other people. I think there's a qualitative difference, and that's what we learn. We learn to follow the best resonances rather than resonances to our worst instincts. So, inner government, outer government, it is difficult to take responsibility for the outside world. I didn't create it. I had no part of it. When I read news articles, what I say, this is how I prune. This is how I edit what I read. If I read an article about a decision that someone made, and there's nothing I can do about it, I may read it for information so that I can understand the decision. But sometimes the articles are phrased in terms of, here, argue with this. And I think it's a done deal. I can't argue. At some point, I have to accept there's a continuation, that there's a place where you elect someone or you allow someone to be in charge, and they make decisions, and you can't chase after them constantly. And I've got to let that go. And so you have to catch the next train, the next bus, the next opportunity. So what I use to distinguish these two is whether they are generating a sense of fear and anxiety in me, or whether they're trying to inform me. This is what's happening. This will be what will be reflected in your daily life or in the global situation. But if they are trying to appeal to my fear, they're making me think that I can react and do something about global government, which is not possible. So, spiritual meaning of political systems. There are many systems. They reflect many different outlooks. What I've been focusing on this week is, somebody phrased it very well. I love participants' comments. Somebody phrased it very well this week, and they said, well, I think I'm just an autocracy, a monarchy. We are. Internally, we always are. If internally you are a plebeian democracy, meaning everything you do gets voted on, and the majority wins, then you're not governed by principle. You're not governed by a central set of rules. You're governed by whatever pulls the majority of your sensory apparatus, your thinking apparatus. Instead, I believe most people are working with an internal autocracy or monarchy, where we listen to the arguments and then some part of us makes the decision. Pathwork challenges what part that is. Now, think of it historically. I read a lot about different historical periods, but particularly about English history, kings, queens, prime ministers. They've had a volatile history. And sometimes it's the advisor that's pulling the strings. And sometimes it's the queen pulling the strings on the king. Sometimes it's his children. Sometimes it's his earls or his court that is influencing the decision. Some kings say, I'm using the phrase based on English history, some kings say, I couldn't help it. That's what everybody wanted. I just had to do it. That's an abdication of one's powers. But if I argued with them, they'd throw me out. That may be true. And then they would have to take responsibility for their decisions. It wouldn't be your decisions that created a long-term problem. It would be their decisions. And that's one of the aspects of leadership. When do you agree to be thrown out of office? And not enough of us are willing to make that decision. I would claim that if people would quit when things got distorted or the realization came that they were not in tune with principles that they had agreed to in the first place, whistleblowers, let us say, if people would quit immediately when they realize this and shift, there would be less evil perpetuated in the world. Part of the evil that is perpetuated in the world is by good people hanging in there because, gee, it might turn around. I'll just keep hanging on. It might turn around. Even that is a form of leadership where we are making decisions about our own powers, our own influence, our own life force to be invested or attached to something. So while this may all feel very random, I don't feel it is. I feel it taps into everything on the planet. But again, I like to be simplistic. It's fun, it's easier, it clarifies. In the Hans Christian Andersen story, The Emperor Has No Clothes, it's only the kid that points at the king who's been fooled by his con men weavers and who has then forced his court to agree with him rather than risk his displeasure. The weaver said the clothes are fantastic when they were bogus. And so the king's walking around in so-called invisible clothes because only wonderful people can see them. And the king can't admit he's not wonderful, so he has to pretend he can see them. And this goes on and on with the court and the king and all that, people who are affected by his influence. And then he walks among his courtiers, and some little kid says, the king is naked, he has no clothes. And the truth is undeniable. And the truth spills out. The people see it. The king sees it. The courtiers see it. All of us have the capacity to say what is true, and it will provoke change. And we are afraid of that change. I invite you to see that leadership is standing in your power to see truth and determining where to say it and how to say it. And sometimes, and I have many experiences of this, sometimes you can say it badly and you lose your power. And that's a lesson. Try to regain the power, try to integrate the lesson and try it again. Don't run away, just try it again. The other message I get from this lecture, I love this lecture, is that we all have power. And that is really difficult for people to get when they don't exercise power. The guide often speaks of the group he's speaking to. And I teased the other day and said to the people in the group that I was speaking to, if he'd known you were there, he would have said, you guys and the group in 2024. That would have sounded bizarre and might have put off the group he was speaking to. And besides that, we're not the only group. So allow that while a spirit may say, hi, this message I wish to give to you. See if you can take these messages personally. And this is the one I would like to punctuate here. The guide often says you have no idea how powerful you are. Now, imagine they say this to a lowly secretary in a multi-level organization who just does what they're told and pushes paper or lubricates decisions to happen. It is difficult to believe we have spiritual power. I invite you to separate these two realities and to consider that there is the earthly reality, which is we don't have a lot of power, a lot of demonstrable external power. And at the same time, we are divine. We have a divine spark. And in our prayers, in our love for our fellow man, our love for our family, in our private life of devotion, in our ethics, in our interactions with our colleagues, we have power. It's not the same kind of power. But if you become discouraged by the external and you just droop, it's very likely that your devotional power will also droop. You won't feel that you can exercise it. So the guide says over and over to the group he's speaking to, back in whenever, 56, 66, 76, you have no idea of the power this group generates, the love that is generated by this group as they do their work. I invite you to see that in any discussion of leadership, this is about you, not about some external leader. It's about you, how you lead your own life, how you interpret divine law in terms of ethics and morals, in terms of how you deal with your fellow human being, how you interact with your family, that this is a form of leadership, and that kind of leadership around the planet is far more powerful than all the hoo-ha's going on the surface. And if we can align together in the caring of our fellow man, in the love for each other, in wanting to share and be shared with, we can have a tremendous outcome in where the planet is headed in terms of civilization. But if not there, we may actually be generating power for another dimension. I know that sounds abstract, and that's the problem in leadership is you give somebody something really abstract and they say, how do I do that? Well, you don't do it, you believe in it. So this is the juxtaposition in the Patrick lectures between the abstract spiritual and the temporal earth plane. I think this lecture really sparks some thought processes. I hope you read it. Patrick Lecture 242, The Spiritual Meaning of Political Systems, in a very difficult year for humanity in October 2004. And thanks for listening.